actually have several members of my family who have a disability, and I'm really excited to talk to you or discuss with you and listen and share this topic about diagnosis and functional thinking. Just before I go any further, I just wanted to let everybody know that this is being recorded, so if you don't want for people to see you, just turn your video off, and you can also rename yourself if you want to as well. So I wanted to begin today by acknowledging the First Nations people and the traditional custodians of the land on which we are on today, and many of us are scattered around the world and connected via Zoom. I'm on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present, and I extend that respect to any other First Nations people here today. And I acknowledge and respect that the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here in Australia, where I am, have always used resources from the land for water and nourishment and healing, and are our first researchers and leaders. So as I said, today we're here to discuss diagnosis versus functional thinking. And in the field of developmental disability, there's been considerable debate and tension regarding the best approaches to thinking about how we engage and serve children with developmental challenges and their families. And in many places, service eligibility is based upon diagnosis, and we can talk about that here this afternoon. But some may see this approach as putting pressure on families to get a diagnosis and on service providers to make a diagnosis, whilst others will argue it's really important to have a diagnosis for families to move forward, and that interventions need to be specific to a diagnosis. So I'm going to begin now by playing a video, and this video was put together by members of our team of the International Academy of Childhood Disability, talking about some of the things that we need to consider when we're thinking about diagnosis versus function. So I'm just going to stop share and then hopefully share the right screen with you. And just let me know if the volume doesn't work.
Welcome to this session. We are members of the Global Professional Education Committee of the International Alliance of Academies of Childhood Disability. And as a group, we have been thinking about this topic for a little while. And this is, we've called it diagnostic approach versus functional approach. Is it really a sensible question? And what we would like to do is have a little discussion and a taster of what we've been thinking about and share it a little more broadly with you, and also hope that you will take this conversation further. So first, I would like to invite you, Peter, to tell us why we've been thinking about this, and tell us.
Oh, no. Thank you.
Welcome to this session. We are members of the Global Professional Education Committee of the International Alliance of Academies of Childhood Disability. And as a group, we have been thinking about this topic for a little while. And this is, we've called it diagnostic approach versus functional approach. Is it really a sensible question? And what we would like to do is have a little discussion and a taster of what we've been thinking about and share it a little more broadly with you, and also hope that you will take this conversation further. So first, I would like to invite you, Peter, to tell us why we've been thinking about this, and tell us a little bit more about what we are talking about here.
Thanks, Arnab. I'm Peter Rosenbaum. I'm a developmental pediatrician and health services researcher, and have been concerned that by focusing just on diagnosis, we are missing vital information which we ordinarily think about as clinicians of any sort, pediatricians, therapists, and so on, when we're asked to work with a child and family. We have a long tradition of thinking both diagnostically and functionally or categorically. And an example I use is thinking about lymphoma. When we have lymphoma, we want to know whether it's stage 1, 2, 3, or 4, because that has really important implications for both treatment and prognosis and the way we talk to the person who has the lymphoma. If I'm going to refer a child with cerebral palsy to one of you, you're going to want to know how old the child is and what they are able to do. What's their GMFCS level, for example. So the idea of focusing just on diagnosis, or quite frankly, just on function, is clearly a limitation, and we believe we need to expand our thinking.
Thank you very much, Peter. I think that is the gist of where we've been coming from. And we recognize that there are different kind of approaches globally, depending on where in the world you are. So it'll probably be a little bit helpful to find out more about how we've been thinking. So Jenny, let me invite you to say a little bit about yourself, but tell us, how are people thinking about these issues?
Hi, I'm Jenny Carroll. I'm a physiotherapist. I think it's very different across the globe how people are thinking about it, and even within different countries. It's almost like a spectrum of, some people are very diagnostic, some services are all organized really around diagnosis, and some more towards the disability. And I think that there's real positives for both, isn't it? And in some ways it's new thoughts that we're having, but also thinking about how certain disciplines have been organized for many years. Therapists particularly have been thinking more around a more approach around models that have disability, and like the occupational therapists have many models that look at the person, the individual, in terms of their function and what they do, models of occupation. So I think there's some thoughts around there already, but I think what's nice around having a more disability focus is it puts the child and the individual in the center, and then the diagnosis is something that affects them and all the other different things, the environments around the model, very similar to what the ICF does really. But it's just, the diagnosis still remains very important, but it's how we perhaps move towards a more person disability centric model. But I think it varies across the globe about what people are doing and how that is working.
Thanks, Jenny. So yes, indeed, both are important. And it is about how people are thinking about and how they are applying it. And I guess once we start discussing it and trying to change how people are thinking, there certainly would be a lot of opportunities, but there may be challenges as well in how people might perceive it. So Bernadette, can I invite you to first say who you are and then tell us a little bit more about how you think what those challenges and opportunities could be.
Thank you. Yeah, my name is Bernadette Gillick, and I'm a physiotherapist and a neuroscientist. And I think this is the key point, is one question that might be asked is why change? Why shift, or why incorporate this? And models are powerful, and ways that we think are very powerful. And just as Jenny said, keeping the child at the center and thinking about the child, this is child driven. So we've got this opportunity to incorporate the diagnosis, a very important aspect of this that might direct care. But we have the opportunity also to look at what's the function of a child? How can they participate? What's their activity level? And who are all the people that are involved, the stakeholders, including the caregivers and the parents, equally as we work together to support this child throughout their lifetime. So I think that there could be a potential reticence or fear of, well, why are we thinking of changing this model, or why are we challenging a model, age-old model of this diagnostic-driven viewpoint? But I think actually, in a lot of ways, we already have been doing this. It's opening the door for the opportunity to incorporate more and to explore how can we support this child in different ways at different times throughout their life. So I'm excited that we're having this conversation and we're thinking about this from a more global perspective with the diversity of cultures, the diversity of care, and certainly the child as the center of that entire discussion.
Can I add a comment to that? Because I think it follows directly. We
strongly espouse the international.
Just going to say, we'll just leave it there now to open up the discussion to our panel who are here today, and I thank them very much for their time. I'll get them to introduce themselves first, and then we'll open up for questions. But Christine, can I ask you to introduce yourself first?
Oh, thanks, Alicia. So I'm Christine Imms, and thank you for the invitation to have this conversation. I'm an occupational therapist by professional background and currently holding the position of Apex Australia Chair of Neurodevelopment and Disability on the Melbourne Children's Campus, so at the Melbourne University and the Hospital and Murdoch Children's Research Institute.
Thanks, Christine. Willika, are you happy to go next?
Hi, and again, also thank you for the opportunity to be part of the panel. I'm a physiotherapist by background, but my main reason for being here today is I'm a parent of a child with a disability. So that's my focus today, and thank you for inviting me.
Well, thank you very much for being here. It's really important to have the parent perspective, so we really appreciate your time. Gordon.
Thank you, Alicia, and thank you for inviting me. I'm a paediatrician at the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne and head of neurodevelopment and disability.
Thanks, Gordon. And Mary Claire? I know you're having a bit of trouble with your sound.
I know, I'm hearing you okay. So Mary Claire Waugh, I'm a paediatrician and a rehabilitation physician at the Children's Hospital Westmead, heading up a large team of clinicians who provide services, inpatients and outpatients.
Thanks, Mary Claire. And finally, but not least, John.
Hey everyone, and kia ora to the Kiwis that are joining us. My name's John. I'm a physio that's been practicing in paediatrics for the last 8 or so years. I've been here in Melbourne for about 5 and been working primarily in the community schools. And I'm currently doing a PhD in the Uni Melb alongside Alicia, Rachel Tooby, Christine Imms and Nora Shields, and it's looking at cycling.
Thanks, John. And people, please feel free to put your videos on during the talk. We can sort of see who our panel is, but it's always nice to see everyone's faces as well. But I'm going to start off with some questions for the panel myself, but please feel free, if you've got a question, to put it in the chat, or please put up your hand. Using the reactions is helpful because then you all get moved up to the top of the screen so I can keep track. But if you you can always just put your hand up yourselves, or as I said, write a message in the chat to everyone, or you can also, if you want to remain anonymous, you're welcome to message me directly in the chat as well. So John, I might actually just start with you, because thinking about your PhD project, what do you think about focusing on diagnosis versus function, and what are the implications?
Yeah, I guess when I first, because obviously we got to have a little look at the video and stuff before, and I guess what sprung to mind was Peter's point around kind of expanding and trying to actually integrate both diagnostic and functional approaches. And I think, depending on the context or the area that you're working in, but really from the organizations that I've worked with, it's really about celebrating a more person-centered approach and strengths-based approach. So one of the research pieces that I'm doing as part of the PhD is CHAIN, which is looking at cycling through adaptation, inclusion, and supportive networks. And one of the kind of key points or things that we're trying to promote through CHAIN is just basic disability principles and basic kind of inclusion principles, and really kind of bringing to mind the social model of disability as well, and kind of really bringing that into focus as well, that bringing that, I suppose, like the barriers that people, I suppose, social model of disability for people who maybe aren't so aware is a model that's kind of been set and created by people with disability. And it's really placing, it's celebrating it's kind of incorporating that people are living with impairment, but they're disabled by elements in the environment around them. So things like physical barriers, communication or attitudinal barriers from society and that around them as well. So I guess it's working towards trying to support those barriers and those needs.
Yeah, thanks, John. I guess if we take a step back now and just think about the journey of a child or families and think about what happens along that journey. And I think diagnosis is a big part of it for families. Gordon or Mary Claire, do you want to comment on what you think the role of diagnosis plays? Either of you.
Happy to. Well, Mary Claire,
you go first, Gordon, that's fine.
So I think diagnosis is always a form of shorthand, and there's always much more left out than's put in. And also, I guess it's important to remember that the diagnosis might be different in different contexts. So many kids will have lots of diagnoses. They may have a single descriptive diagnosis, but there will be many diagnoses. I think that there's also a lot of heterogeneity amongst any people with a singular diagnosis. So the label in no way describes the whole group of children, and like any shortcut, it really leaves out a lot. And so I think we, to some extent, already include functional measures as part of the broader kind of diagnosis that we use. And I think that's been the case in particularly in psychiatry for a long time, where they've used multi-axial diagnosis. And I think we're increasingly doing that. But I think so the functional elements really have to be part of a more encompassing diagnosis in my view. But even with that, we'll leave other things out. We might talk about motor function, but we might not talk about cognitive function, or we might talk about social function. So I think diagnosis is useful, but its limitations have to also be borne in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And Mary Claire, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
Yeah, I think there's been a massive change in thinking about a person with a diagnosis. I don't think I ever speak about cerebral palsy without adding GMFCS max, eating EADC or communication function as part of that picture. And even with other diagnoses that come through our service, we just use those descriptors as an equivalent. They're an equivalent GMFCS 2 or 3, which will then help us to understand quickly what a child's level of mobility or eating or communication is. So I think diagnosis, I think, has an absolute place for the families in trying to work out the why. Did I cause this? Is it my fault? What will happen next? Which is a really big deal for all families. So I think, as is suggested, we need both, but we shouldn't provide our services based on a diagnosis. If someone doesn't have a diagnosis, I'm always kind of curious to find out, what do we have something that's going to be progressive? Do we have something that has some really targeted treatments like dopa responsive dystonia or deep brain stimulation? I mean, there are some really good things that you need a diagnosis for, but it then goes with a functional approach to, will we make a difference to this particular person with the stuff and difficulties that they're having in their life? So it's part of it, but it's peripheral. Very important at the beginning, I think, of a child and family's journey through all of this maze that is disability management.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that brings me to my next question, which I wanted to ask you, Willeke, in terms of, do you think that things have changed for you over the journey with your son from the beginning to now, and how the importance of diagnosis versus his function has driven what you do?
Yeah, I think so. I think having a diagnosis is important, and I guess it's probably almost more highlighted by people or children that don't have a diagnosis, and the added complexity and difficulties that can sometimes add for them, and that it can be a barrier to some of the things you've talked about, which is like finding and accessing support. So from that point of view, I guess for us, you know, the diagnosis, it gives us an idea of what lies ahead. It certainly doesn't give us a clear path, but it gives us an idea of what might be ahead for us. But function is very much important, and a hugely important part for that. Initially, it gave us a direction and also provided us, I guess, with some avenues for networks and information and support. But then you quickly learn as to how diverse a diagnosis is, and that's where function becomes very important. And I think, you know, with CP, the diverse range for diagnosis is huge. It can make it easier to explain to others, but that can inherently also be associated with preconceived ideas that then might not be relevant to, you know, your child or the person that you're discussing this with. So it can be beneficial and not as well in those regards. I guess, yeah, it highlights the huge variability and complexities that lie inherent in diagnoses, and function therefore is very important. And I guess for my son, like I asked him about that, the diagnosis, and he actually said, you know, it gives him a reason or an explanation behind why things happen. So why he is feeling or sees or is experiencing the things that he's experiencing functionally, he can sort of now grasp how that sort of happens in his body. So I think as time goes on, the function is almost more important. The diagnosis sort of sits in the background and does direct and guide things, but the function is ultimately one of the really important things for progressing forward.
Yeah, thank you. And Christine, if I come to you now and ask in terms of your research into childhood and adult disability, where does diagnosis versus function sit for you, and what are the implications?
Thanks, Alicia. And I guess you know, starting life as an occupational therapist, at least my adult life as an occupational therapist, put function on the front seat straight away in the way of thinking. But I would say that as to whether having a diagnosis is important, to my mind, it depends. I think, you know, if there's no diagnosis, and for many families and children that we meet, there won't be a diagnosis, at least for a period of time, and that certainly isn't going to stop us proceeding, stop us thinking about how to engage, how to support families and children going forward. But over time, I think, Alicia, in answer to your question, is we've really moved and shifted, haven't we, to an ICF-focused world where we see that actually how we live in our worlds is not just about our diagnosis. That's a very particular, comes from a particular place and is for a particular reason, a diagnosis to guide treatment, to guide and direct the opportunity to provide something that might change an outcome from a health perspective. So from my perspective, the importance of diagnosis is for really guiding and directing those interventions that are directly targeted on a person's body. And as soon as we start moving away from the body and start thinking about activity and participation, then the interventions that we want to have guided are not going to be necessarily best guided by trying to fix a child or trying to fix a person. Actually, the explanations for the problems and the assessments we need to do need to be in the context, in the situation, in the environment. And I think that harks back to John's comment about having a broader social focus, a social model that underpins our approaches, is where I would see us today, is trying to bring those things together. So every explanation in the child has to be matched by an explanation in the environment. This child has a cognitive impairment. How is the situation set up to reduce complexity so this child can function?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the comments in the chat is, from a functional point of view, would be good to have an alternative to disability with more of a focus on different abilities. And I think that fits sort of into that as well, and thinking about it's these environmental barriers that cause these effects on function rather than the child necessarily. thank you for your comment, Mary Claire. Does anyone have any questions or anything that they would like to share from their perspective?
Alicia, while people are thinking, I wanted to just touch on something that Willika had said from your son, Willika, and I think reflect on some comments that young adults we've been working with CP tell us, and how they really want the world to know how diverse people are who have CP, that one phrase is just simply not enough to explain who they are, apart from anything else, but also not to explain the condition. And the other comment that I was reflecting on was their comments around how the community has a very medical perspective of cerebral palsy, and they would really like the community to have a broader perspective than that. And I'm not sure if other people have thoughts or have things to say about those aspects.
Yeah, it's interesting. My brother has autism, but in fact, he's got a severe intellectual disability and is non-verbal. And it was always interesting growing up when you said that you had a brother who was autistic, because that was around the time of Rain Man, and everyone thought that he was very different to what our reality was. And so I've always been very aware of the spectrum of autism spectrum disorder, but the fact that one label, as Gordon was saying earlier, and many children have several labels, doesn't describe who he is or how his disability affects our family. So it's something I've always been very conscious of, is just it's good, as Gordon was saying, to have these shorthand descriptions of things that help us group things, but it doesn't necessarily describe the breadth of what we might see. Mary Claire.
I think I was sorry about the capitals, Christine. I wasn't shouting. I think we've got a huge challenge with this. I think it's happening slowly, but it's in the entire kind of government systems have to change, because if you have a diagnosis of X, you can get into this particular service or that particular service. If you have a level of intellectual disability that falls below a certain line, you get funding in the education system. In some of my services here, you need to have a diagnosis to get into particular clinics, and we're in the midst of changing that, but it's really hard. And you would think that the rehab department would be able to change that really quickly, and we aren't. So, we don't have a continence service or a mobility service. We've got a movement disorder service, which is fantastic. It's cerebral palsy and movement disorder, so it allows for that broader, whatever movement challenges you have. But if the other services we have are really kind of siloed, and we're in the midst of trying to change that, which is exciting. But we've been doing this for years, trying to broaden it and say, just because you're unable to walk and you're deconditioned from 6 months in hospital doesn't mean you don't deserve to come to the rehab service, but you've got to be squashed into a particular clinic or a particular service, which is not helpful. So it's a challenge.
Gordon.
I just wanted to make a comment on the couple of comments in the chat about genetic diagnosis, because I think it's really made an enormous difference to our understanding of kids. I think it's really important, and it's become part of our diagnostic description to always try and include an etiological diagnosis as well as a functional diagnosis. But it like other diagnoses, there's so much difference between individuals with a single label that it again doesn't fully encompass people, and I don't think you obviously can, but it certainly is something that has become a real change in the last 5 to 7 years, a real emphasis on etiological diagnosis and the importance of it. And I guess, the hope that we'll get more targeted treatments in the future, but that's still a long way off for the vast majority of conditions.
Yeah, thanks, Gordon. And it's actually something else I'm quite aware of, because my brother who's 5 years older than me, and I've also got an older sister who's 7 years older than me, so my brother's the middle child. And the reason there's an age gap for us is my mum wanted reassurance from the doctor that if they have another child that they won't have autism, and back then they were told there's no genetic link, and of course we know differently now as well. So it's interesting how it's important that science has progressed, but sometimes not having that information. Luckily things worked out well for us, but it is interesting as well. But I think having those genetic links is important for families for planning for things as well. Christine.
Yeah, I suspect we're all in furious agreement that the diagnosis is important, and I think the expansion of thinking as being the way to go. The other thing that I would say is that taking a functional perspective opens opportunities for alternative ways of thinking about solutions and ways forward as a community and a society. But I don't think I would never want to take away from that opportunity that's afforded by a really discrete diagnosis that leads to a particular intervention that is helpful. But I wondered whether Jane wanted to talk a little bit more about her comment earlier in the piece around moving from disabled to able, and because I think there's as much variation in function as there is in anything else, and our capacity as a society to be open to diversity, I think, is one of the things that I think would be worth exploring.
Thanks, Jane.
You want? Yep. Okay. Well, thanks, Alicia and Christine. Yes, I struggle with this. People talk about differability and all sorts of clumsy terms like that, but we all know that people who have a disability in one aspect of their functioning can often be remarkably resourceful and use other aspects of their functioning to develop skills and abilities that are very impressive, and people show their resourcefulness, and so when we're talking about disability, I feel like it doesn't acknowledge the resourcefulness and positive aspects of people's growth and development that happen as a result of having one area that's a bit weaker. And I just wonder what other people think about that.
Jane, do you think, can I ask a follow-up? Sorry to put you in on the spot, but I just, for me, disability is by definition a social construct. So it's not the person, it's the environment. But I don't think that's how the word is commonly thought of or used necessarily in society. So
no, that's exactly right. It's not used like that. Yes, not everybody does live in the ICF world, and hard as that is to get your head around, Christine. And so the way that it is used commonly is a restriction, is a limitation on the way people are seen, and doesn't acknowledge that the breadth of people's abilities in that regard. So yes, I agree with you.
Any other comments or experiences from people? How do people find, in terms of getting access to therapy, that diagnosis is really important? And if someone doesn't have a diagnosis, how does that affect access to therapy?
I was just going to pick up, that was an excellent point, Jane, around everyone living in the ICF world. I guess I'm definitely in Christine's camp as well, and I think I feel like there is definitely a movement towards greater pride, like disability pride, and people with disability being very accepting of their disability, and like, in a way, there's 1 in 5 people have disability. By the time we're 80, 1 in 2 of us are going to have disability. And so it is a reality for all of us, really. I guess I think coming from, there's pros to diagnosis wise, there's definitely some pros as a physio that I can say, like, and it's comforting and reassuring for families and for young people, as we've heard, and even for us as clinicians, and particularly with CP, yeah, and having that comfort that it's ruled out other kind of progressive neuromuscular kind of things as well. But I was going to just comment on like report writing and kind of grant funding and that kind of thing. So things like ENQ reports or educational needs questionnaires for school application for getting funds in that regard, and that kind of and on NDIS as well. Often some of the language that we're using is still, as a clinician, it's often we've been told and trained to gear this language and make it as deficit focused as we can. And who's reading those reports? It's parents are often the ones reading them, and we're building that rhetoric into what they're reading, which I find quite difficult to do. And I think we kind of maybe need to shift away from that, but I'd love to hear other thoughts.
Very true, John. And it's, I'm sure, unfortunately, many of us have had that experience where we've had to say to families, just letting you know when you read this report that we're focusing on the deficits so that we can ensure that you get funding rather than focusing on what the child can do. Gordon.
I think the point you raised too, John, about the NDIS, I mean, it's the philosophy of the NDIS was never supposed to be diagnosis focused, and yet in reality it very much is, and the lack of diagnosis really drives one of the biggest problems with the NDIS in my view, which is inequity. There are many drivers of inequity, but that's certainly one, and I don't know how we change that. I think it's something that we really need to lobby hard, because I think it's really just contributes to some of that unfortunate inequity within our system.
And the other part of that inequity, Gordon, is the fact that you can pick a diagnosis and a level. So this is a person with cerebral palsy, GMSCS 3, and then suddenly a whole lot of doors and access and services are open for a young person. But if a young person is a GMSCS 1 or 2, you then have to spend, the clinicians have to spend an inordinate amount of time writing a long and detailed report to argue for the fact that this person who has activity and participation limitation has a right to have some services to be able to live their life. So I was also just thinking about, there was a presentation at one of the meetings that most of us, or a lot of us were at, which was a mother talking about her daughter who was labelled with a diagnosis, or she went to a particular service delivery agency and they were talking about what she couldn't do. And she then said, you need to think about what my child can do. Her strengths are that she has the best smile in the world, and she can unconditionally give love to persons and those sort of things. And I can't remember who it was, but it was the most wonderful presentation of what are your child's strengths? What are they really good at? And how can we help your child to do something that you think that they would want to do, which is a very rehab sort of focus to goal setting. It's not about my goals, it's about the family's goals, and goals are very much central to rehabilitation, which I'm a passionate deliverer of rehabilitation.
Thanks, Mary Claire. I'm going to actually jump to Willico to get a parent's perspective, and then I'll come back to you, Christine.
Sorry, Christine. I was thinking about two different things, I guess. One is absolutely in terms of, our perspective or my son's perspective, even if he, I guess, had a person next to him, had exactly the same diagnosis, exactly the same functional difficulties, the same functional abilities that he's able to do, I think they would still have very different and unique wants. They still are very much individuals. They're still a person. Yes, the diagnosis and the functional level that they have is very much a part of them, but he has his own needs, he has his own wants, he has his own goals, his own desires. So that then, to me, is very important and would lead to a different management and different needs and outcomes for him. That we need to still talk to him and discuss what he wants to be able to achieve. And in tapping into that, his strengths, as Jane mentioned, he's got incredible strengths in different areas. So, looking at that is very important. And I don't know if where his strengths lie will sort of guide him to where he ends up wanting to be, but he definitely has goals and different things that he wants to achieve. In terms of the NDIS, I think we have, or over time, we've seen a big change in how important function is over our, I guess, rehabilitation journey, and it's become very much more of a focus, even though it already was at the start. It's part of allied health, our rehabilitation work. But in terms of the NDIS, it's given us an incredible opportunity and more options for funding than there ever was. However, we're encouraged to, I guess, focus on goals and focus on their strengths. I guess one of my concerns is that if we just highlight his strengths and we don't actually point out and highlight the goals that he has and the difficulties he has with achieving these goals, are we actually going to get any funding, or will that affect the funding? So I find that we are still very much needing to focus on that, those letters that Gordon was talking about and John were talking about, that highlights, the what we can't do, what we have difficulty doing. And in terms of working that out, how that changes in a funding perspective, I think will be quite challenging, but it certainly needs to be, I think, looked at. It's a tricky part, and I think it's complex from both ends. It's difficult from the parent and clinician's perspective. It's also difficult from the funding perspective.
Yeah, thank you. It's complex, and that's the important part of these discussions. Just thinking about myself, and if you ask me what all my goals are and the reasons why I can and can't achieve those goals, it's a lot to think about, isn't it? But Christine, I'll hand over to you.
I think that was what I was trying to say when I was saying there's a diversity of function. I can tell you all the things I can't do, for sure.
Absolutely. And the NDIS really looks for you to plan ahead. And it's quite tricky at times, really tricky.
And I think, Willika, you really highlight, with the goals of your young man and the age that he is and the thinking forward, and how uncertain that time is for many young people in terms of setting a future-focused goal, which is really what is wanted in the NDIS environment. And I guess the reason why I had put my hand up was to have a bit of a response to the NDIS difficulties with equity that Gordon certainly raised, and we certainly hear when talking with parents and young people, both the comments you've made, Willika, about how delighted people are to actually have a service in a way that they've never had before for those who've been able to achieve that, but also that sense of fear and uncertainty about what they have to do to hold on to it. And while the NDIS started out with what we would consider to be the perfectly correct approaches around function and future focused and participation and being able to have the resources you need to do the things that are important to live a good life, actually the implementation of it has fallen short. And so the shortcuts that I think, again, Gordon, you talked about diagnosis being a shortcut. Well, that's a shortcut in the eligibility criteria now, isn't it? That creates those inequities. But the other thing I would say is that the NDIS was never intended to provide resources and services to every person in Australia with a disability. There's a whole other layer of infrastructure, services, supports, investment in the community that's meant to sit alongside that, which used to be called Tier 2, which has not really been enacted, and we really need to be lobbying for that as well, because that's the change the world stuff that we really need to have in place here in Australia, that really does enable people from quite a diverse perspective in terms of their functional capacities and goals and so forth to be supported.
Yeah, thanks very much, Christine. And it's just made me think as well, and just going through some of the comments in the chat too, is it would be good to hear about experiences in other places as well. So experiences in New Zealand, but also there was some comments about what about for Indigenous families. And I don't know if anyone else in the Zoom room wants to comment on that as well. I know Shan has been doing a little bit of work in this area, and Sarah's also commented as well, if either of them want to put their videos on. Or perhaps not. Shan.
Hi. I just thought I'd add a couple of comments to some of the work we've been doing in New Zealand, and it's more about the earlier diagnosis discussion and this idea of having a strength-based approach versus a diagnosis-based approach has been discussed quite a bit here in New Zealand. And maybe I want to throw it back to you guys as the panel, and in those early months of a child's life, how do you talk about functional thinking as opposed to, and is it really opposed to diagnosis thinking in itself? Can we not work together with that?
Yeah, I think it's a really important thing, Shan, because of this, many things such as cerebral palsy, for example, being such a heterogeneous condition or diagnosis, that it's really important when we talk about the diagnosis to then talk about function and what the potential outcomes might be, and putting that together based upon the individual as well. And obviously we can't predict, it's very difficult to predict the exact function of a child, because there's so many things, like we've been talking about, that determines function. But I think it's really important to talk about what it does mean in terms of function as well, which I think doesn't always happen. But Gordon, do you want to make further?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of people have different views about that that early period and what's important, the label or functional diagnosis. But I think in terms of helping families with therapy, the functional diagnosis is paramount. And sometimes it's not possible to give the correct label, or there's an enormous amount of uncertainty around the correct label. And I think that's a really difficult thing. But I think in terms of what you do, the functional label is absolutely paramount.
Jane, did you want to make a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to come back to that issue of goals, because one of the issues I think with the NDIS that I've seen as problematic is that it's very good at focusing, well, that's arguable. The emphasis is on focusing on the goals of the individual, which is really, of course, central and important. What's important to that person? What's important? What are their priorities in their life? But what gets forgotten is what's important for that person to maintain their function, optimal health and function through their life. And that's where the experience of clinicians who've seen this before, who've worked with children and adolescents and adults with disability before, and know that natural history and know the prognosis and the arc of function over time. And those goals sometimes get left out. They're the goals of achieving and maintaining optimal health and function, because they're not the ones that the parent or the person has, because it's the very first time that person has ever had cerebral palsy, and it's the very first time those parents have had a child with cerebral palsy usually. So, you know, to let them benefit from the experience of all those who've worked in the field for a long time, we need to have those goals included as well.
Absolutely. Very clear.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. And part of the goal setting and review at key timeframes might be, you know, starting school, starting high school, leaving school, or, you know, turning 16 and thinking about driving. And many a time I've said to a young person, so are you going to get your driver's license? And they kind of look at me and say, can I? And you sort of go, well, yeah, of course you can. We just need to go through the steps. You know, they just never think to do that because no one asks them. And meeting and reviewing kids as they grow and develop to think about the whole range of things, you know, whether it be living away from home or getting a part-time job and how to help with that, or learning to play a musical instrument that's adapted to whatever their ability is, learning to drive and the like is hugely important, and something that a lot of families don't actually think about. They think that life has stopped, but that the hope for someone to do everything that they ever wanted to do is different because of a diagnosis. And then it's a wonderful experience to be able to say to someone, so what about getting your license? And they kind of go, really, me? Go, yeah, of course we can do this, which is fabulous. And it's something that I think those regular reviews of function and the broad aspect of that, and it's a bit of a plug for rehabilitation paediatricians or paediatricians who are good at disability management, to think about what's important for life and function and the F words in the reviews, and how you might be able to implement that, because a lot of kids will need help to access the services, and some of the people in those services know exactly where to go to do that.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Mary Claire and Christine.
Yes, I think, Mary Claire, sadly we still live in a world where many people who are really great advocates get things, and people who don't have those skill sets kind of miss out, and that's not how we want it to be. I think it's really important, isn't it? I wanted to make a comment about the sort of conversation we've had at the moment has been mostly about individuals, about children, but I wanted to see if we could think a little bit more about the family as particularly in those early years, but all the way through, as the family as one of the core unit. It's a really awful phrase, but the sort of focus of our concerns and interest and interactions. I was thinking, Jane, as you were talking as well about, it's not just the individual's goals, it's the unit that need to work together to collaboratively to actually enable those things. And so we also have an NDIS currently that doesn't really have enough flexibility in it that supports a family unit.
Yeah, there's some comments in the chat about that as well, that when we're setting goals and talking to families about function, it absolutely needs to be about the family's function. Willika, do you have anything that you would like to add to that?
No, I agree with all of that. It absolutely should also incorporate the family and the family's function. And I was just thinking about yourself, Felicia, just even the siblings. So it's the whole family unit. It's not only the parents as well, because it has an impact on siblings as well. And that's, to my knowledge so far, hasn't really been incorporated in NDIS sort of funding models. I could be wrong there. Yeah, and I totally agree. I think, you know, we've been lucky. We've got an amazing team around us that I take for granted some of the times how amazing our team is, and therefore, you know, I think it's important that we are really strong advocates for the person that we're discussing or we're talking about, and we're lucky enough that, you know, if I'm not a strong advocate, I've got somebody else in my team in that regard who is. So building a team around the person and the family, I think it is hugely important. And totally agree as well that, you know, the therapist and the team around you have that bigger picture view. And although they don't necessarily live the day-to-day, I think by coming together and having those great discussions around function, look, where are you at now? How does that impact on your day-to-day? This is where we potentially could see you leading to. And as Mary Claire highlighted, letting us know what other options are out there. Don't limit our options. And I guess from my perspective, I'm lucky that my son doesn't actually limit his options. He's a very good advocate for himself as well. So he doesn't let us go down that path, but we're not, you know, not everyone's that lucky. And so therefore, having that team, I think, is really important and vital. And and I think knowledge is power, as we all know. So the more knowledge we can get, and whether it relates to yourself or whether it relates to somebody else that we meet in the waiting room, or we're waiting for someone else and we can share that knowledge on, I think is important as well. You know, those informal networks are really important as well.
Yeah, thank you. And as you say too, things change over time as well within that family unit too. And for me, myself growing up, as I said, my brother's older and my sister's older again. So my sister was actually very much advocating for my brother very early on, wanting him to go to school and things with her, whereas I was oblivious to those things. And my parents were I was very grateful for what I was able to do, because I was very aware that it was challenging having our family circumstances as well. So I was always very grateful for what I could do and making sure that I could fulfill my, I guess, goals or possibilities as well. I potentially didn't set myself some goals. But as I've got older, interestingly, my brother ended up getting an NDIS plan because he didn't get a lot of intervention when he was young. He's now 50. And for the first time in many years, he's got some speech therapy and OT, which is quite amazing. But there's been this transition, whereas in fact, unfortunately, we've had different family situations that now my sister and I actually manage my brother's NDIS plan as well. So things change over time within that family unit and how that family functions together too.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it changes along the spectrum of the, you know, the life. And, you know, I've already noticed that he's only a teenager so far, but, you know, noticed that from early intervention through to sort of primary school through to now secondary school, teenage, the needs and wants and the needs around the family change as well. So yeah, very important. And it is very difficult to, if we had that crystal ball to look into the future, our goals would be much easier. But you know, I guess we base them on as much information as we can get. So the more information and the more goals, and obviously his wants and desires. Yeah.
Thanks. John, I'll leave it to you to make the last comment for our session today.
Closing comment. I was just going to pick up on Willike's point there around just, I think the responsibility for us as allied health practitioners, so physios, OTs, or whoever's going into the home, and just doing our due diligence to really investigate participation and investigate routines and life interests and passions and like you said, for the family unit as a whole. And like, I think simple things like a standing frame. One of my pet peeves is physios who are anyone who prescribes a standing frame with the aim of just focusing on things like bone strength and lung health and all the things that we know physiologically they're really important for, but not really giving any indications as to when that might be a good time to actually use that standing frame. What are routine times in the family's day where they actually are standing and they're up and about in the kitchen? When might be an opportunity to build that into the family's day? What way could they potentially play or engage in it? Do they need mounts or different systems to help embed technology or their iPad or that simple things like that to kind of make the standing frame a bit more interactive and actually a fun place to be in?
Thanks, John. And I think that is actually a nice place to end. And I think Christine said very early on that I think we're all in agreement that diagnosis is extremely important, but we do need to be focusing on function and not only function and goals of the individual, but of the family as well, and being considerate as to how these things change over time too. So thank you everyone for attending today. And once again, happy World Cerebral Palsy Day, and really appreciate you joining us. And we have these sessions regularly, so please, if you're not members of the Auth Academy, please become a member and you can find out when we have our sessions. And also just a reminder to people as well that our early bird registrations close for our conference next year as well. So thanks again everyone for attending. And thank you to our panel, and a big thank you to Willike, but all of our members of our panel. Thank you. A few of us are going to hold on the line.